Welcome. Tamra, Lucid, and I have written a book called The Unobstructed Way about one of our favorite subjects in my book, American Metaphysical Religion. Stewart Edward White and his wife Betty, the most extraordinary story of life and love after death that Tamra and I have encountered in our years of research. Carl Jung privately wrote that he believed Betty had, through her channeled communications, proven she had survived death. We decided to share the first chapter with you here on YouTube. If there is interest, we might do the same for the other chapters, so please let us know if you want more. Proof of the continuity of consciousness after death. In his epic, The Odyssey, Homer portrays Odysseus performing a ritual that makes it possible for him to talk with the dead. Senior assistant keeper of ancient Mesopotamian script, languages, and cultures at the British Museum, Irving Finkel, proves in his book, The First Ghosts, Most Ancient of Legacies, 2019, that all ancient cultures had tales of ghosts and communications from beyond the grave. But in the mid-19th century, a wave of experiences with spirits arose unlike any seen before. The wave could be said to have started with A Christmas Carol in 1843 by Charles Dickens, not only the most famous ghost story in the English language, but also the most popular spiritualist book in history, though it was written before spiritualism had a name. In 1849, the Fox sisters publicly demonstrated spiritual communications with ghosts by means of mysterious knocks, initiating a fad for seances in America and Europe. Interest in spiritualism only increased after a retracted confession of fraud by one of the Fox sisters. At a seance in France in 1855, Allan Kardec was given the mission of compiling a book of questions and answers that were meant to present the insights of the discarnate about life and death. He published the influential The Spirits book in 1857. The book became especially popular in Brazil. That first wave of spiritualism might be said to have culminated approximately 80 years later in the Unobstructed Universe teachings that are the subject of our book and of this talk. From rural Quakers of the pre-revolutionary colonies to college professors of the 21st century, Americans of every persuasion have been preoccupied with ghostly chats. Social media, reality TV, and talk shows can make a medium or ghost hunter famous overnight. Yet most Americans dismiss mediumship as fraud, entertainment, or at best, a low rung of the spiritual ladder. To many, it appears to be a trap set by the devil himself. The exceptions worthy of interest, such as the well-known Edgar Cayce and the obscure Edward A. Monroe, are few and far between, and they contrast sharply in ethics and results with a multitude of mediocrities and outright frauds. Some of us wonder if that life after death stuff is real. Why hasn't anyone ever put together a quality plan? A history worth telling. What kind of plan would we put together with the far-seeing wisdom of a soul free of body? Could it involve true love? Perhaps a romantic married couple, without children, so that family responsibilities won't complicate their explorations. Seasoned world travelers sipping champagne on yachts, but also hardy hikers in the wilderness, safari veterans whose own story, without anything supernatural about it, would be worth telling, like the time they brought the first bird of paradise plant to Santa Barbara, where now you can see them blooming almost anywhere. Perhaps at a dinner party, some friends pull out a Ouija board. The husband ignores his wife's reluctance. He tries it out for fun. In an atmosphere of facetious frivolity, they replace the planchette with a whiskey glass. When the glass moves, his wife thinks her friends are playing tricks on her, so she watches from a distance, ignoring their denials. The joke seems to be going well until the glass very firmly spells out, "Why do you ask foolish questions?" The wife thinks they're teasing her again when the glass spells out her name repeatedly and urgently. Just for kicks, and to show them she's not afraid, she finally joins in. The glass spins in circles like a happy puppy. With her fingertips on it, a new message repeats, "Get a pencil, get a pencil, get a pencil." A few days later, alone at her desk, feeling foolish, the wife sits with pencil in hand before a blank sheet of paper. To her surprise, her hand moves involuntarily or unconsciously. They call it automatic writing, messages from the other side. Intrigued, her husband helps her puzzle out the words. The writing flows from beginning to end, uninterrupted by spaces or punctuation. The messages they decipher are deep enough to invite further exploration. They find themselves in touch with what most people call spirits. Then the trance channeling begins. On condition of anonymity, she channels popular books that demonstrate, quote, the here-ness of immortality, end quote, and that, quote, consciousness is the starting point for everything, end quote. But she dies before her mission is complete. Will she speak from beyond the grave? Once the medium, now the spirit being channeled, can she prove beyond any doubt who she was and who she still is, finishing her book with another book, a bestseller? Her husband is a red-blooded, old-school, no-nonsense American, an outdoorsman and dedicated conservationist. The kind of guy they name not only a subspecies of golden trout after, but also a grove of sequoias. You could picture him camping with Theodore Roosevelt in the California wilderness. Teddy would call him the best shot who ever fired a rifle on his range. A man with experience of mines, frontiers, lumber mills, and a world war. A man so good with a gun he could fill a hall with taxidermy, trophies, and sardonic enough to call it the Ark. It includes a leopard he strangled with his bare hands when the unfortunate cat attacked a member of one of his expeditions. In his will, he donates his collection to the California Academy of Science. The kind of guy who could break his leg on a trail and drag himself for miles back to camp, stopping along the way to shoot a game bird to bring back for dinner. His wife and the philosophy she's channeling convince him to give up his gun for a camera. Perhaps he's a very successful adventure writer with a good skeptical head on his shoulders and a way with words, a Jack London type, as handy with a pen as he is with a pistol. The kind of man who would approach his wife's mediumship the way he did the Serengeti, as a practical, detail-oriented explorer, an open-minded observer, never giddy, always ready. Let it happen during a great international crisis when people need inspiration, when death is everywhere. Not just a first, but a second world war, to part more lovers, families, and friends than ever before. A time when reassurance of reunion and beyond is most needed, when frauds flourish, compounding the agony of loss. Of course, as you may have already guessed, every detail is true. The Ouija board experience that started it all occurred on March 17, 1919. President Theodore Roosevelt listed Stewart Edward White as one of 6 naturalists to whom, quote, we owe a real debt, end quote. He also called Stewart, quote, the kind of young American who's making our new literature, end quote. In 1905, Roosevelt appointed Stewart a Federal Forest Reserve inspector. Stewart held the office for 4 years. In Roosevelt's autobiography, writing about his Sagamore rifle range, he wrote, quote, "The best man with both pistol and rifle who ever shot there was Stewart Edward White," end quote. These are only a few of the surprises in the biographies of Stewart Edward White and his wife, Elizabeth Betty Grant White, the other Betty White. Their work is known by only a few today. But when Betty died, Who's Who, convinced by her posthumous authorship, declined to print her death date. Celebrated psychoanalyst Carl Jung had this to say about the work of the Whites. Quote, "I would recommend to anyone who is interested in the psychology of the unconscious to read the books of Stewart White. The most interesting to my mind is The Unobstructed Universe, 1940, end quote. Jung wrote a skeptical foreword for the German edition, but in a letter about the Unobstructed Universe to his friend Fritz Kunkel, Jung admitted, quote, "Betty behaves like a real woman and not like an anima. This seems to indicate that she is herself rather than an anima figure," end quote. He concluded, quote, "I must own that with regard to Betty, I am hesitant to deny her reality as a spirit. That is to say, I am inclined to assume that she is more probably a spirit than archetype, although she presumably represents both at the same time," end quote. When Jung left Freud to find his own way, among his colleagues was a future MD named Tina Keller. Inspired by her interest in Tai Chi, she was the first to bring movement and dance to Jung's active imagination therapy. In a 1971 lecture at the C.G. Jung Institute, she said that Jung gave her the Betty book when it was published in 1939 at the beginning of World War II. She, quote, "read and reread," end quote, all the books that followed and left us this testimonial, quote, "Betty White, the brilliant woman who had accidentally discovered her mediumistic gifts, dictated to her husband, the writer and explorer Stewart Edward White, a long series of teachings full of wisdom and salty humor for practical application in living. They were communicated by different personalities, or quasi-personalities, whom the Whites dubbed the Invisibles. It was stated emphatically that only those who really practiced the teachings could, through experience, come to understand them. My own experiments, based on the books, proved this to be both true and extremely important," end quote. Hitler's blitzkrieg had devastated Poland. Betty had died mere months before. As we shall see, Stewart was convinced of her survival. The continued presence of her companionship, stronger than ever, intimate and unique, comforted him daily. Other friends reported similar visits, sometimes accompanied by small signs, often at the mention of the name Betty, any Betty. Friends wondered why, for 6 months, Stewart made no effort to reach Betty through a medium. Stewart preferred the term he learned from the book Our Unseen Guest, a receiving station. Later, he admitted to his readers that he had been afraid. What if Betty didn't communicate? What if the communication was so obviously inferior it could put doubt into all their work together? Would he search vainly from medium to medium the rest of his life? But that wasn't his only reason. Stewart was convinced that with her extraordinary training, Betty must be doing important things in the unobstructed. A sentimental conversation seemed disrespectful. Stewart didn't want to stay home where Betty's garden of rare and exotic plants died despite the best care money could buy. So 2 years before the attack on Pearl Harbor, he once again traveled through America, having been invited to visit his many friends who wished to console him. When Stewart visited Joan and Darby, the authors of the spiritualist classic Our Unseen Guest, he knew a session of channeling was inevitable. Stewart asked that Joan make no attempt to reach Betty. As soon as Joan went into trance, Betty crashed the party. She began by calling Stewart Stewt, the name for him she had only used in private. Then she provided all the proof he could want. In The Unobstructed Universe, Stewart wrote that Betty began, quote, talking to me quietly, fluently, with assured and intimate knowledge of our common experience and living. There was no fishing and no fumbling. That part of it became almost ridiculous. It was so easy for her, where with usual psychical research it has been so difficult. Here in this first evening, she literally poured out a succession of these authentications. She mentioned not one, but dozens of small events out of our past, of trivial facts in our mutual experience or surroundings, none of which could by any possibility be within Joan's knowledge. End quote. Through Joan, Betty also talked about shared personal experiences that embarrassed Stewart. Betty reassured him that Joan was not conscious of their conversation. Joan had recently had an experience that had puzzled her. She had been compelled to take the wrong bus, which led her to a store she had no intention of visiting, in which she found a Chinese red lacquer box carved with swallows. When told this last one had been sold, she insisted the salesperson look through the stockroom. He found one left behind, which Joan eagerly purchased. On the way home, she came to her senses and wondered why she had bought the box when she already had other lacquer boxes and no room for a new one. Betty explained that she was the one who had compelled Joan to seek out that Chinese box. It was a gift for Betty's younger sister, Millicent. Betty added that the carving of the birds was the important part. She asked Stewart to reimburse Joan. When Stewart presented the gift to his sister-in-law, he asked her if she had ever talked about a carved red box with Betty. Millicent answered, quote, when I was on the coast with you in 1936, Betty and I saw one in Chinatown. I was crazy about it, but it was much too expensive. But later I thought it over, and I wrote her asking where I could get one. I must have written her 3 or 4 times, but somehow she never answered my question. End quote. Stewart told Millicent that Betty had emphasized the importance of the birds. At first, Millicent was speechless. Then she explained, through tears, that when they were children, every spring, Betty would help her climb into a tree where they watched fledgling swallows nesting in the eaves. According to Stewart, such impressive examples of specificity, quote, accumulated into several hundred, equally good. Like any other evidence often repeated, it has forced acceptance by its volume and invariable accuracy. 1 thing is accident, 2 is coincidence, 3 is remarkable coincidence, but 100 or more just simply moves out of that category. That is why I am absolutely certain in my own mind. End quote. The work of the Whites concerns that key moment of human life described in the Tibetan Yongdrung Bon scripture, the precious garland. In the process of death comes that moment, quote, when consciousness remains as an orphan with no support, end quote. The Invisibles worked with Betty to help her cross that threshold going both ways. Speaking from beyond, Betty explained that the work she had done with the Invisibles during her lifetime in the obstructed had helped her learn to adapt her consciousness to the unobstructed. But the step-by-step process had actually been provided to give her extraordinary training in coming back to communicate with Stewart and their readers. What followed, Stewart described as, quote, 40 sessions of communication with Betty, sessions vivid with her unseen presence, from turn of phrase and mode of thought to her own special brand of fun and laughter, end quote. With the world at war again, Betty said that the intent of all this effort was to encourage people to find their own proof of the continuity of consciousness after death. She asked her readers to imagine how different the world would be if we understood we are temporary visitors with other destinations ahead of us instead of desperate creatures struggling for a brief hour in the sun. She wanted to provide reassurance for families who lost loved ones as the war killed millions. Using the exercises in the books, anyone could experience the unobstructed. The key is relaxed appreciation. Stewart asks us to cultivate the feeling we get when we admire a beautiful sunset, to enjoy the sound of frogs chirping in the night, or the sight of, quote, good old pups, end quote, as he puts it, wagging their tails, leading the way on a walk. He asks us to notice how it expands our senses, how we experience what we've been missing wrapped up in our own thoughts. Bird song, the tint of the sky behind a lush hill, small wonders that refresh the soul. He says for most people, the soul is like a dehydrated husk. Betty, from beyond, denied that she was now in a different world. The difference is not in location, but frequency. The frequency of the dead is not visible to the living, she said. The world of human bodies exists at a much lower frequency than the intensely vital world of pure conscious energy. According to Betty and the Invisibles, consciousness is the matrix and sustenance of form. Electric current, a hunk of granite, a bee buzzing by, in every variation of matter, at the center of the particles that make forms, consciousness exists. 3 sentences stand out in the metaphysical works of the Whites. Quote, consciousness is everything. Attention is existence. The individual is immortal. The obstructed universe, end quote, Betty explained from the afterlife, quote, is for the purpose of birth, of the individualization of consciousness. All matter is born in your universe. Nothing is lost. Individuality is not lost, though in its lower forms matter can be burned, turned into gas, or what have you, yet it is all kept. It is the highest form, the soul, that goes on undivided. Your scientists have accepted the law of the indestructibility of matter, but I say to you that this law is only a corollary of the indestructibility of consciousness, end quote. Among the implications of the Betty books is that we are all immortals who forgot. From that point of view, the institutions of the great religions that set up shop as gatekeepers to paradise are selling water by the river. No one has a monopoly on rites of purification or human transcendence. Paradise was waiting within us all along, a heritage waiting to be remembered. If we die in forgetfulness, the human details of the life we lived fade into objective history. A new set of circumstances of incarnation replace them. New loves, new families and friends, new favorite pets, new hobbies and talents. Perhaps there will be a great awakening when the soul recovers all of its memories. But until then, each incarnation is like starting out all over again. Betty's poetic sensitivity to natural beauty and her wholesome, humorous, and sometimes sublime advice about living a good life were eagerly read by a nation at war and in mourning that found hope in the revelation that the mysterious Betty was none other than the wife of the famous writer beloved by generations. Stewart could have built a metaphysical empire from the attention he received. Mrs. Leslie Kimmel, Stewart's secretary at the end of his life, said he had an aversion to meddling in other people's affairs. He amused himself by reading, seeing movies, gardening, and dictating letters giving advice to seekers, who were encouraged to think it out for themselves. 2 cairn terriers followed him around, one chosen from beyond by Betty. As Kimmel told the story, quote, his cairn terriers, Toto and Bibi, Swahili for little boy and little girl, were always at his heels. Toto, quote, the little yellow dog, end quote, which Betty found for Stewart shortly after her death, was a real person, and with him Betty made some of her most amusing demonstrations. Often Toto would sit up opposite an expanse of bare wall, looking intently at a spot less than 5 feet from the floor. Betty was 4 feet 11 inches tall, waving his paws in the way he had been taught to show that they were clean, and obviously begging to be played with. Then he would go through all the motions of retrieving a ball, scuttling across the room and under furniture, returning it with, quote, it, unquote, in his mouth to be tossed again by his invisible companion. Kimmel described Stewart as, quote, a reticent, even a shy person. The very quietness of his manner invited confidence, and his genuine interest encouraged one to talk freely, end quote. Elsewhere, she wrote that Stewart had a, quote, light touch. The humor which made him such a popular dinner guest carried over into every aspect of his life, end quote. Kimmel described Stewart in his later years. Quote, he always carried with him the feel of the outdoors. His skin was bronzed and ruddy. His eyes had that indescribable expression characteristic of people who are accustomed to scanning the horizon. Even in his 70s, he had the appearance of being much younger, end quote. But Kimmel wrote, quote, no matter how vividly he might feel Betty's presence, the life he had shared with her for so many years was over. The house was big and quiet. The garden missed her magic touch, end quote. In a letter to Kimmel, Stewart admitted that it required resolution to face, quote, the loss of the physical presence of so vibrant and exquisite a personality, end quote. Kimmel recalled that Stewart spent an hour a day meditating in Betty's blue room, where he felt her presence and received instruction. Private interviews were granted to people seeking help only after Stewart felt more secure in the support he believed Betty and the Invisibles gave him. The many requests for a school or organization of some kind were, quote, gently but determinedly discouraged, end quote. He didn't want to convert anyone. He often said, quote, every fellow has to find his own way, end quote. Stewart and Betty's books have been reissued periodically by publishers, including psychedelic paperbacks from the 60s and 70s that were sold in airport and resort gift shops. Today, most of Betty's books are available online in PDF, text, print on demand, and other digital formats. Admirers and skeptics alike are left to ponder how Betty has fallen into obscurity, even in metaphysical circles. As we shall see in the following chapters, their life stories were as amazing as their books and their philosophy. Students of The Secret of the Golden Flower, Neoplatonism, and any other esoteric doctrines and techniques of transcendence will find familiar concepts in Betty's Unobstructed Universe, presented in a delightfully practical and unpretentious way. Well, thank you for hanging out. The next chapter will be a true story of love beyond death. And let me know if you would like to hear it in this format. If there's enough interest, then definitely Tamra and I will talk about it and see how far we're willing to go in sharing this with you online as simply a video. It is the most remarkable story that we have found in our research, as mentioned earlier, and it gives us great joy to be able to share it with you. Thank you, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.